Imagine if we could say, when being interrogated by a psychiatrist in the psych ward or something, why did you do that? Why did you give out flowers on the street? Or why did you get on a plane to a different country? Or why did you do that? Imagine if we could say, well, my assumptions dropped and my space of possibility expanded so much that it seemed like the next most logical step. Bo Lotto says, and continuing with what he says in The Neuroscience of Creativity, Perception, and Confirmation Bias on the Big Think YouTube channel. He says, for the person being creative, all they're doing is making a small step to the next most likely possible based on their assumptions. So one could say for a person in map consciousness, in mania, all they're doing is making the next small step to the next most likely possible based on their assumptions. And Bo says, the observer wonders how they link something so far apart, because for the observer, they are far apart. And one might say that a family member wonders how they did something that is so out of character, because for the family member, it's so out of character when we have a different space of possibility. So for me, in map consciousness, this creativity, this creative perception, this open space of possibility isn't separate from daily life. It's happening in daily life all the time, from moment to moment, for an extended period of time, weeks, months. And so that designs and unfolds a different way of living because of the creative perception. Regular people and psychiatrists, they have a different space of possibility, so they don't feel like the things that we're saying are possible, so they call them delusions. When a delusion is infusing different meaning into a moment. From my perspective, they don't know what's possible when we operate without a self. And neither do we as people who go into these spaces of operating without a self, but each time we go into that, we can learn. We have the opportunity to learn a lot more than people who go into those states through psychedelics, because in the psychedelic state, they only have a day or so. We have weeks and months, and we can learn a lot. And imagine if we could say to doctors, well, my salience network in my brain upped its capacity and the default mode network went down. So I wonder if so-called mental illness is only something that exists from the outside, from a viewer, like a psychiatrist who's trained to see people that way. Because for the person in map consciousness, they're just making the next small step. They're making the next logical step based on the no-self algorithm. And can we design a life that is more in step with the no-self algorithm? And with our space of possibility being different, being so open, and not having the precognition of things, but really responding something directly in the moment. If we feel we're in danger, we're going to act as if we are in danger. And it's something that happens very viscerally. The whole body responds. So I was thinking about this in terms of other people, and that they're not necessarily egos. They're more like restricted spaces of possibility. So I could think of somebody that I know in my life as this person who maybe I don't resonate with or something, but really they're a restricted space of possibility, or I see them as restricting my space of possibility. Not that there's an ego there, because the ego isn't really real, but their assumptions and their possibilities are really small. And what does psychiatry do but come in and make our space of possibility very small for the rest of our life? And Bo says they may have more complex space of possibility as they have more complex biases and assumptions. And that's what happens to us in map consciousness. We develop more complex assumptions and biases. And Bo says maybe they've assimilated other cultures. Well, in map consciousness, we're assimilating another culture. It's a language of the cosmos and of humanity, and we are absorbing that and assimilating that and moving in that dimension and realm. So then that increases the space of possibility and the directions of our gestures and behaviors moving forward. And when we get dragged into psychiatry and we're really fighting it sometimes, we're trying to defend that space of possibility. We absorb the culture of map consciousness. We're being cultured in it when we're in that space. And I watched another video by Bipolar called Thriving in Uncertain Times. And he said that wisdom is being at the edge of chaos on average. And that's an interesting quote because people who go into so-called mania are thought to be quite chaotic. And it is a very chaotic state, and it's very powerful and strong. And that's why I feel like it's important to harvest, practice, and embody and be a little more chaotic in daily life so one is in chaos on average as opposed to just having extreme chaotic events. And then Bo says, I want you to doubt at the most fundamental level, even at the level of your perception of reality. Now, this is a neuroscientist. Imagine if our psychiatrist said that to us. What if we said to our psychiatrist that I'm doubting at the most fundamental level, even at the level of my perception of reality? Because Bo is inviting us to do that as people in regular consciousness, yet when that happens non-volitionally, then we're seen as mentally ill. So it kind of bothers me when there's these people out there, scientists, saying, do this and this is all wonderful, yet when it happens without us thinking that we did it, then we're mentally ill. And that's really the fundamental difference. It's okay to go there if you think you went there by your own volition. But if something just happened and there's this big change, well, then you're mentally ill. And Bo says, do you see reality? We believe that we see the world as it actually is. So he's pointing to the fact that none of us see the world as it actually is. So even a psychiatrist sitting there doesn't see the world how it actually is. And they're seeing their patients how they've been trained to see them, not how they actually are. And Bo says illusions are sometimes we don't see the world accurately. And he says the eyes have little to do with what you actually see, and context is everything. And that was an important point for him, was context is everything. Well, map consciousness changes the whole context of one's life. All the conditioned context drops away, and a different context comes into play, and literally does play with our perceptions, and play with creating our perceptions. And map consciousness is trying to change the whole context of our life moving forward. If we can have a 2 months experience where nothing that we thought was possible, all the meanings were changed, we behaved differently, we had different experiences, wouldn't that change the context of our life? But then we're given the context that we're mentally ill. Because when that bottoms out, we're very vulnerable, and then we're hypnotized into believing that. And Bo says the brain evolved to find relationships, not absolutes. And I feel like the self functions more in absolutes in what we think we know. When we go into map consciousness, our brain is more in seeing relationships and seeing how things mean things, and that's part of synchronicity, is seeing two things that are meaningful coincidences and seeing the relationship between those two things. And that's actually part of the big jump. That's a small step. So Bo says the brain only makes small steps. But if one has a big meaning in one's heart and then sees something related to that meaning, it's a small step based on meaning, but it's a big jump in that the action might seem like a big jump. And he says context is everything as information is meaningless. So it's meaningless without context. And that's why for this year I've gone through the process of creating so much meaningful context for myself. So that is the context that brings meanings into my perception, not just the pool of meanings that I was given after I was labeled with a mental illness. Like, oh, this means it's a symptom. Oh, this means it's this. This means I should take a PRN. And Bo says information is meaningless because it could literally mean anything. Yet, after we're labeled with a mental illness, We have these experiences, we have this information internally, and we're trained what it means. Even though it could literally mean anything, and we can create any meaning out of it that we want, we can create context. We're given a context to say that it means mental illness. And in map consciousness, our context changes from our personal history context to an infinite context of humanity. And Bo says, how does your brain make meaning? Memory. How do you make meaning out of meaningless information? By physically engaging with the world. So for me, we need to engage with this world of map consciousness in order to make sense of it. If we're afraid of it and disengage from it and don't make any meaning and sense out of it, it will always be there to haunt us. And by engaging so much in the world of mental illness and the system, we're engaging with this information in the context of that, which will continually reaffirm that that is the truth. And the trouble is, before we go into map consciousness, when we have this self-program, all of that conglomerate of information is all that we've been given and conditioned to believe. And that all breaks down. We go into a different state. It makes us question all that. But in the fallout of that, we're given a new set of beliefs to believe about ourselves, which is that we have a mental illness, which is what the process was attempting to deconstruct in the first place, was our propensity to just believe everything that we've been told and given throughout our whole life. And Bo Lotto talked about someone who did an experiment where they raised rats in a deprived environment and an enriched environment. And then they looked at their brain cells, and the rats that had the enriched environment had brain cells with lots of nice branches, and then the ones that were in the deprived environment, the brain cell was not very branchy. It looked very feeble. It looked like Charlie Brown's Christmas tree. So this relates to how, when we're given a mental illness label, a lot of times we disengage from the world, and it's not an enriched environment, it's a deprived environment, deprived from social contact, and that's partly how our brain shrivels up. And then it's said to be part of the mental illness that our cognition declines, but it's not that, it's the deprived environment, and that the meds do that. They actually make us not want to reach out to the environment. So not only is it the meds chemically, it's also the fact that it leads to a de-enriching of our environment and our gestures and movements throughout the world. And then Bo said that if she raised the rats in an over-enriched environment, the rats' brains looked like the ones in the deprived environment. So it's possible to do too much, and Bo says doing too much is relative. So I feel like when we go into map consciousness or so-called mania the first time, it's an over-enriched environment, and it actually does lead to the brain kind of frying up over time. And then it's important to harvest, practice, and body to change the relativity of what is too much. So that was too much that first time. And then we rest and recuperate. Then it happens again, it's too much. But if we just wait in between and we don't do anything to enrich our environments and make our environment richer on a daily basis so that it's not relatively more rich, or if we just sit in a basement and wait for mania and then it comes, it's going to blow out our brains. But if we are in a process of learning and channeling that energy and engaging and in dialogue and wondering and making meaning and context, then that energy is not necessarily going to come in and blow out our brain cells, because we've created such a rich context through which the brain can understand these rich states. So there's a rich context for understanding these rich states, not going from a deprived context of daily life and then being in this really rich state and not having a rich context through which to hold that. And then Bo says, your brain evolved to continually redefine normality. Now imagine saying that to a psychiatrist after being in an altered state for a period of time, saying, my brain evolved to continually redefine normality. My brain was redefining normality. And he said a more complex world, a more complex brain. Map consciousness is definitely a more complex world than the conditioned, habitual, reflex one that we've created to live in. So map consciousness is trying to redefine normality and create a more complex world and a more complex brain. It's become too simple with its me-self structures, seeing everything as it relates to oneself and one's security, not seeing how oneself relates to the greater whole. Map consciousness is trying to redefine normality to include seeing how one is related to the greater whole and feeling related to it, not just seeing it, but feeling it, and by feeling that, acting based on those perceptions of feeling it, not feeling disconnected. And Bo says the brain doesn't see reality, but a meaning that was once useful in the past. And I feel like this is where it's different in map consciousness. The meanings that were useful in the past are no longer meaningful. They're not really there. So something else comes in and adds meaning that's really relevant to the present moment, not looking back to the past. And by doing this, it creates different behaviors and different actions, and our life unfolds differently. And each time there's meaning infused in the moment and we act on that, the next meaning becomes available to us. And so we can go far into this territory. In map consciousness, nothing is seen as once useful in the past. One sees those elements that were thought to be useful in the past as meaningless, hence moves away from so many things. I have a little bit more to talk about on this one.